think who's hired your
Susan.
Oh,
I didn't know that.
yeah.
Oh, terrific.
Can we might kick off now? I'm just here for a second to thank you all for coming and to welcome you to the launch of our industry forum during Writers' Week. Just explaining to the guests that this is the first time we've been able to do something like this, but we've had the funding and the cooperation from the with the Writers' Festival, so we're really excited, and it's great to see a room full of people. We need to get some more chairs, which is even better. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet here today on Ghana land, and I would like to thank our sponsors, which is the Adelaide Festival through the Adelaide Writers' Week and the Australian Council Literature Section, I think it's now called. Could you make sure your phone's off? We've got stairs to the front and rear of the building, the emergency access. You go out behind the lifts, and there's stairs on the outside of the building. The toilets are just behind here. You go out and around. And I'm just going to introduce Jennifer, the chair, because she'll introduce everybody else. I'll read her bio. Jennifer Mills is the author of the novels Gone and Diamond Anchor, and Diamond Anchor, and a collection of short stories, The Rest is Wait, which was shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards. We've got copies of that here. And on Saturday, Jennifer won the Barbara Hanrahan Fellowship from Arts SA, a $15,000 award for a South Australian creative No, it's not, but I needed to say that, and we're really happy. Also, Ali Cobby Eckerman and Vicky Wakefield both also won awards, who are both members and will be appearing in this program. So congratulations to all of them. And I'll leave you to introduce our guests. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks everyone for coming. As you know, these forums are a really great opportunity to get a sense of sort of the nuts and bolts of the industry and get your head around publishing and the professional sort of development angle of being a writer, which is very important. And we're very, very fortunate to have three fabulous experts with us today. On my far left, Jane Novak is from Text Publishing. She's worked in publishing for over 16 years, and before that was a bookseller. She's currently the head of publicity at Text, which is one of Australia's great independent publishers, I think constantly winning Publisher of the Year. Based in Melbourne, they also run the annual Text Prize for Young Adult and Children's Literature. Julianne Schultz in the middle here is the founding editor of the Griffith Review and a professor at Griffith University. She chairs the Australian Film, TV and Radio School and is also a member of the board of the ABC. As well as publishing longer form essays around particular themes, the Griffith Review publishes fiction and runs an annual novella contest. And next to me is Jack Sparrow, who's an author of books including Money Shot, A Journey into Censorship and Porn, Killing, Misadventures in Violence, which are dark. He's also the editor of Overland Literary Journal, where I'm the fiction editor. Overland's the most left-wing of the literary journals and probably the one with the strongest online presence and the strongest focus towards supporting emerging writers. Among other activities, Overland runs annual Emerging Writers prizes for fiction and poetry, and we've just launched another prize for Indigenous writers. So I wanted to start with the nuts and bolts a little bit and ask Jane if you could maybe explain to us what is the process when your book comes out, it's on the shelves, how do people discover it? How does the publicity thing actually work? What do publicists do?
Yeah, there's often a lot of confusion between what is publicity and what is marketing, and they are actually two quite separate things. I mean, one of the easier ways, I guess, to explain that is that usually marketing involves money and publicity you try and do for free. But so if I go right back to the beginning, at Text, publicists are very much part of the acquisitions process. So right from the very beginning, when we're reading a manuscript for the first draft, we're already thinking about how to tell the story of that book, whether it be fiction or non-fiction. And then if we go on to acquire the book, I always like to meet the author really early, so then I can start figuring out how to tell the story of the author, and also how to help the author tell the story of their book and of themselves. because you need to craft some kind of narrative in order to get media interested. There's more competition than ever. You know, book pages are shrinking. I'm sure you're all aware of that. Papers are sharing their content. So you need a bit more than nice man wrote book. That's which the book might be fantastic, but we still need a little bit of a story. So I would start there, and then probably 3 to 4 months out, I would start talking to literary editors, letting them know that the book is coming, giving them the first little taste of what the book is, who the author is, what their background is, and then start send out early pages about 2 to 3 months before the finished book comes out. So it is quite a long process, and then you sort of go from there to publication date, and that's when you start kind of crafting your interviews. And whereas marketing is more about selling that story to the booksellers, so to the trade. So our marketing department is doing the same thing, but they're talking to all the key account buyers, they're talking to all the really good independent booksellers, letting them know this book is coming out, we think this is the right kind of book for you. It's like this book, which we know you sold really well. So trying to find comparisons so that they have some tools to sell it, and then also looking, getting in bookseller catalogues, advertising, that kind of thing. Does that help?
Absolutely. I think I wanted to ask a little more about this idea of the author's story as well. The copy for this work, for this forum, quotes Brendan Behan saying there's no bad publicity except an obituary. And I think that I disagree. I think actually death can be the best thing that can happen to a writer's career. Because how much does that story matter? Like, how much does the story of the author matter? We get quite often these new faces, newly discovered people, I think, at the festival. We have Ellen McCatton and Hannah Kemp, both of whom have been writing for a long time, but whose narrative is meteoric rise to stardom. Does that attract you as a publisher when you're looking at somebody?
Sure, but you want to get them before before that meteoric rise, because you want to have them, So Hannah Kemp, someone like Graham Simpson as well. You find writers in a variety of different ways. Text is still one of the few publishers that has a slush pile, so we accept unsolicited manuscripts. A lot of the big publishers don't anymore. So every Friday, the whole company downs tools and we read the manuscript slush pile from 4 o'clock. We found quite a few fantastic writers like that. Hannah Kemp had an agent. So that's how that big deal got done. Graham Simpson doesn't have an agent. He won the best unpublished manuscript, and then that's how we got to have a look at it. Obviously all publishers are interested in publishing stars, but it's more interesting to find the next star, I think.
What about from the perspective of literary journaling, Julianne and Jeff?
I might just add a little bit to what Jane said. I think that sometimes there's a temptation, there's an uneasy conflation between the writer's story and what they can actually do. So that you might actually have a writer who's got a great story, but actually the writing is not as good as the story about their own life. And in many cases they're not, some people are able to write that into a way that will be of interest to a broader audience, but many people can't. So in a sort of media-driven agenda, you can sometimes find that there's more attention to a work which may not actually be of the highest order, but whose writer has got a great story.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And that can be complicated for readers as well, because you go and read it thinking that this is the great thing because there's a fascinating story, and actually you read the book and think, what was all that about?
It's a bit average.
A bit average. good, interesting life, average book.
And then as a reader you feel constantly deflated.
Well, that's right. And it does then make you wonder if you're trusting your own judgment in terms of the quality of the stuff. You see this all the time. The publicity, and I'm not saying that this is what you do, but the publicity machine can get ahead of the product.
And that can be damaging.
Absolutely, yeah.
There is a strange contradictory pressure on authors, though, isn't there? On the one hand, you spend hours by yourself in this incredibly introspective process of crafting a manuscript, and then at the end of it, you're supposed to come out and be this raconteur who can tell great stories and be
more
really
than
outgoing.
Ever before. Yeah, it's certainly it's been heading more and more down that direction over the last 10 years.
And can actually tell the backstory of the book. That actually, the backstory, if you're the writer, is actually the least interesting thing, because the backstory was the grain of sand that made you produce the work, which is what you want people to read, rather than telling us, oh, well, these were the influences that led me to doing it. Yeah, so
And I suppose as well that's where a publishing company can come in and help you look at the work from the outside in a different way and kind of see where it sits. But in terms of publishing for the Griffith Review, Julianne, how much does somebody's track record count if they've submitted something to... Do you look at their CV? Do you look at...
Look, it depends. When we have, over the 10 years that we've been going, have published about 700 authors, and of that 700, about a third, it was their first sort of serious professional publication. So slightly under a third, but thereabouts. So in that case, we're looking at the slush pile. I mean, it might be on a recommendation of somebody, some of the creative writing teachers or other authors, or people will say, oh, have you seen this person? Or it's just come in cold. Or quite a lot of those people are actually people we've met at festivals or places like this, who's come up and said, oh, I've got something. So in that case, the track record's, not there, so there's nothing to look at. I think that what we do, as opposed to some of the more commercial, we're sort of quasi-commercial, but some of the really commercial enterprises, is that they will want to make sure that they've got absolutely half a dozen big names on the cover. And the problem with that is it's the same people saying the same thing and crowding out the space for new people. So we're sort of pretty determined to... So we look for names, but we also... I think part of what we try to do is to have that juxtaposition, so that you've got somebody who's well known against somebody who nobody's ever heard of, and so the pieces rub up against each other, and that's sort of an important part of our approach.
Yeah, well, that all resonates with me as well. I mean, obviously, every magazine editor wants to have, a name on the cover that will get you into bookshops and will allow you to sell and all the rest of it. And the other aspect of publishing, people who are established, you can tend to be more confident if they say that they'll get your manuscript at such and such a date, they will do it and it will need minimal work and all the rest of it. Whereas if you're, it's quite a brave editor who commissions a piece from someone that they haven't worked with,
That's right, yeah.
Before that being said, I mean, the thing that any editor is proudest of is being the first one to publish so-and-so who is a rare talent. Also, I think one of the things the journal does try to do is establish a coterie around it, to build a kind of sensibility that's shared amongst its authors. And Australia, the Australian publishing scene is very, very small, and it tends to be dominated by people who all say the same thing. So, if you can find some distinctive voices and, distinctive prose styles and all the rest of it, I mean, that's the thing that makes you happiest, rather than publishing, another essay by a Fairfax columnist. Anyone could do that, but if you can find someone who says something different in a different way, it's much more satisfying.
And I think that's what the richness of the terrain is at the moment. I mean, you do that very much with Overland. I think with Griffith Review, because we have very strongly themed editions. There are a couple. There are a few people who will pop up across different themes, and we're always very conscious as well of, because we're based in Queensland, of trying to have some Queensland writers. But there is sort of a different pool for each edition, and so I mean, I don't say this with any sort of invidious comparison to the monthly and quarterly essay and the Saturday paper, but basically the lineup of writers that you see in that whole suite is more or less the same, whichever format they happen to be in. And I think that's quite different to what both of us do. Yeah.
And sometimes the effect of that for writers can be that a journal will look like a wall instead of a door. And so I wanted to, maybe it's a good segue into those doors that you do open for people with the prizes and various opportunities that you run. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why prizes, why are they a good way of doing things, and do they succeed in discovering new writers?
They certainly have for text. The text prize, which actually opens today, that's open until April 4th. It's for young adult and children's writing. They're a huge amount of work to administrate prizes, but they're so valuable. I mean, because not only do we publish the winner but quite often we've gone on to publish some of the shortlisted writers. We've also discovered writers who we felt their books actually weren't quite young adult, they were probably adult, and we published them. So Corey Taylor, who's on the program here, her first novel, Me and Mr. Booker, came through the Text Prize. The protagonist is a 16-year-old girl, but we felt very strongly that it was actually an adult novel, so we published it outside of that prize. It's going to be shortlisted for the Commonwealth Prize, and her second novel has just come out. The Vanishing Act was another one that we found that we felt was adult. So we've always published, we've been lucky enough to find quite a lot of talent through that process, and a lot of writers that we'd never heard of before, so a lot of new talent. We are thinking about whether or not we should be thinking about putting together another prize for perhaps genre writing. We're just playing around with ideas, but the Text Prize has been invaluable.
Yeah.
And we published Corey Taylor in Griffith's Review in advance of that process, so that's sort of interesting. We run a number of different things. We've been funded by the Copyright Agency twice now to run novella competitions, because our focus has been on essay and reportage. So what we wanted to do was to look at that slightly longer form of writing, but in a fictional sense. So struck on doing novellas. I mean, that was probably about 3 or 4 years ago we started that. Now everyone's doing novellas, so we'd like to think we're ahead of the curve on that as well. But and so that was actually quite interesting. I mean, the first one we published, I think, 4 novellas, which they were very well received. A couple on the short list were then picked up by commercial publishers. Peter Cochrane's book was published by Penguin as a novella after that, and we've just gone through the process of selecting novellas for the edition at the end of this year, and I can say that we've chosen 5, 2 of whom are named writers, one of whom has published a piece of non-fiction with us before. Another one has published short fiction with us, and one has written a novel before. So, but at a very junior level. So they're people who've got a track record, but they're not, apart from the 2 names, they're not people who would be household names. So I think that's quite exciting. A couple of other things that we do. We have for the last quite a number of years now run an Emerging Writers Prize, which is not something that is open to competition, but rather we go through the emerging writers we've published and select through our editorial team the person who we think will benefit most from having a stint at Varuna. And we've changed the model now, but we've had 2 or 3 people a year doing that for about 5 years, and that's been hugely productive for them, and it's really helped their professional development along enormously. And now we've recently changed that so that we've tried to provide an incentive for people to subscribe. So we have a contributors circle subscription membership where you subscribe to Griffith's Review, and then anyone who's in that category can apply for one of those Varuna Writers fellowships. So that we've figured that it's all very well putting this stuff out, but we've actually we want some reciprocity from readers as well.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think competitions are a kind of necessary evil, that if you had the resources, there'd be other ways that you could support emerging writers. One thing you can do with competition is you have a relatively small amount of money, you can put that up as a prize and generate a great deal of interest and enthusiasm around it. I mean, if you think about it, the theoretical basis of competitions is largely incoherent. There's almost no school of literary criticism that would suggest that you could actually rank the merits of various manuscripts, numerically in the way that you do when you're judging prices. It doesn't really make sense. But if you think of competitions as a way of provoking conversations, it becomes a much more kind of useful process. So, even with the major, even with the major awards like the Miles Franklin and all the rest of it, that's probably the most useful thing about it. It gets people talking about the books and their relative merits and all the rest of it. So we run a great deal of competition. We run the Overland Judith Wright Poetry Prize for emerging writers, which I think has 10 grand behind it. So it's only for people who haven't yet published a full-length book of poetry. Likewise with the prize we do with Victoria University, we do a Nakata Brophy Prize for Indigenous writers, and we're about to launch another short story prize in the next few weeks with a slightly different kind of angle. I mean, they are a way of for the publisher's point of view, they're a way of attracting attention, and nothing gets circulated in all the sort of tweets and Facebook updates that we put out. Nothing gets circulated more than the fact that you've just launched some new opportunity for writers. But also, I mean, they are the people who have won our various awards have usually gone on to other things. It does attract a great deal of attention to the writer, and even when you select somebody who other people don't think it was the best possible poem or the best possible short story, the conversations that come out of that as to who should have won it and all the rest of it are quite useful as well.
It's what, in a way, what Jane was talking about before in terms of the difference between marketing and publicity. I mean, competition sort of cut both ways. They're a marketing sorting exercise, but they're also a publicity tool as well.
Absolutely.
And I think just in my brief tenure of 2 years at Overland, I think that the quality of the submissions for the prize is actually higher than the quality of the general submissions, because there's $10,000 at stake. So people really send work, they polish their work and they send in their best work, which they should always be doing when submitting to literary journals. But somehow the waiving 10 grand sort of makes it a little bit more of an incentive.
Which makes sense. I mean, if you're trying to make a living, if you're really taking this seriously and you want to make a living out of it, you've got to find a pathway that you can get paid for it, and that's, so, I mean, raising the bar in that way, I think, is a really helpful thing, both to provide an incentive for writers, but also to go back to the other end, to the readers, to know that they can be assured of the quality.
God, we read a lot of short stories though.
Oh, I know, I can imagine.
It's exhausting.
But there's a lot of creative capacity out there. It's just,
But I think that there's also a point to be made about professionalism in that context. And I was wondering if you'd have any advice for writers in terms of dealing with literary journals or dealing with publishers about that sort of, when you don't have that track record, you don't necessarily have the experience of dealing with editors on a professional level. And I know that I've recently received a rejection of one of my rejections from an angry person who was very cross with me for rejecting this story. It's always men.
I wouldn't advise that for starters.
Yeah,
I would probably not advise that. Look, I think I was interested in something you said before. We get a lot of submissions to our slush which are not very polished, which really are not in great shape. They are very obviously first drafts. I mean, and I promise you that everything that comes to text gets read. Every single thing that comes in gets read. But, it's a lot of work, and we want to see a first draft. We want to see the best version that the writer can submit. And you shouldn't be submitting unless you think it's the best that you can do. In terms of, handling rejection, well, there's two things I'll say. One is I spoke to a writer in the lobby just before I came here, one of the international writers who's here, Rabi Alamadine, who's a wonderful writer. Told him I was coming here and what I was going to be talking about, and I said, what do you think about rejections? And he said, if you're worried about being rejected, you shouldn't be writing. He said, that's not what you should be worrying about. You shouldn't be worrying about even getting published. You should just be writing because you want to write. The other thing I would say is that, look, you only have to, there's such a long list of writers that we could all give you, fantastic writers who've gone on to be published who were rejected, umpteen times before they found the right home. And that's the thing. I think each publishing house is very individual, and they all have their particular personalities, and you just have to find the right home, I think, or the right editor at the right time. And a lot of it is about timing and, what's fashionable. I mean, there's a great book called A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Ema McBride, which she tried to get published for 9 years. It's very experimental. The writing's very beautiful, but she couldn't get it published. They all agreed it was a wonderful book, but she couldn't get it published because no one thought they could sell it. But 9 years later, it's finally come out, and now she's been feted all over the world, and everyone's calling her a genius. And so I think you just, keep your integrity and stick to your guns. And if you really believe that, the work is good and just keep writing if that's what you want to do.
I think that one of the points that you make, Jane, is a really good one, and well, they're all good ones, but one that I'd like to expand on was that it's about picking your market, picking the space, and being familiar with what it is that particular company or journal or outlet or publication or whatever it is, what their ethos is, what it is that they do, what it is that's likely to appeal to them. So there's not much point in sending, a highly academic work to text, for instance. I mean, it's just not going to fit into their style. There's not much point in sending to Griffith Review a really academic piece, because that's not what we publish. There's not much point in sending a really right-wing reactionary piece to Oakland, because it's not what you're going to publish.
No, not so much.
And so that sort of said, sort of thinking yourself into the space of the organisation that you're pitching to is a really important part of that sort of process, so that you're trying to match it up. Now, some of that's unknowable because there'll be random things that come from left field, but a bit of thought in that process and a sort of a respectful awareness of the of the outlet, I think is really helpful. I think that the general
preferably
point,
a subscription.
A subscription always helps. Yes, that's right. But I think that the other thing that is really important, and it's just a sort of a life lesson really, that is that if you treat people respectfully and politely, they're more likely to treat you respectfully and politely. If you treat people rudely, they're going to say, there's other people I can deal with.
Absolutely, yeah. And also to respect the submission guidelines. They're there for a reason, and it does make the whole process a lot easier.
I mean, if you think about your writing as a form of communication, I mean, it sounds really obvious, but obviously writing is a communication tool. But if you think about it, first and foremost, is you're trying to communicate something to someone. That kind of orientation leads you to see your work in the sort of the network that is Australian publishing, Australian writing, and Australian reading. And I think that helps with the stuff that Julianne's talking about. Too often what happens is people just get a list of all the publishers and journals from one of the writers' centres and just send things off, at random. Whereas if you're thinking of, okay, what am I trying to communicate and to whom, you have much more of a sense of, okay, this publisher, they do that sort of thing, that they reach those kind of people. These are the people I should be talking to. I mean, it's probably harder with fiction and poetry, but certainly with non-fiction, if you look at a journal and you see the kinds of things that they're publishing, and it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything. Nothing. Editors love it when someone sends a well-argued response to a piece that's appeared in the journal saying I didn't agree with it because of this. But having that sort of sense as to where you fit into the ecosystem that is Australian letters.
I think that's a really, really important. It's the thing is that's actually not all about you as the writer. You have to be a reader as well. I mean, it's this sort of reciprocity thing is a bit of a bug at the moment. But if you're not reading what other people are writing, you're not part of that sort of system. So you need to be engaging, even if you don't want to respond to it. You need to be engaging with it in your own head, so that okay, you might come off at a completely at a left field, at a tangent to what everyone else is doing, but you're doing it in a knowledge of what's being around, and that sort of generosity of spirit in terms of engaging with other people involved in the same enterprise, will mark you out as somebody who's both serious about it and thoughtful, and that's they're important characteristics.
I think it actually informs the earlier point about rejection as well. I mean, nobody likes being rejected. It's awful. You've poured your heart out into this piece, and someone says that they don't like it, and it's awful. It's just
and no one wants to write those letters.
No, it's awful writing those letters as well. But I mean, if you have sort of some sense of how you fit into that ecosystem, it can help with that sort of stuff. Because one of the first things you have to ask yourself is, if someone tells you they don't like your book or your manuscript or your story or whatever, ask yourself, are they the reader for it? Do you know, like if you show it to a friend, you're writing a science fiction novel and you show it to a friend and they say it's terrible, and you realise they don't read science fiction, then their rejection is neither here nor there. Likewise, if you send it out to a publisher who doesn't publish the kind of stuff that you, and they send you back a rejection, it doesn't matter. Whereas if you send it to someone who is, the doyen of that particular field and they reject it, well then that's something you need to think about. Is there some way I can improve this manuscript? I mean, it's never going to be fun to be rejected, but it can be something you can learn from.
And it can be something you can benefit from as well in the long term. Yesterday I went to see Alison Bechdel and she opened her talk with a couple of her rejection letters. One was a rejection letter from art school and another was a rejection letter she received from Adrienne Rich, which is a pretty awesome kind of thing to have. She was very proud of it. So you can milk them later. You should see them as a sign that you're doing the work, I think.
And I mean, I think the point that you made before, Jen, in terms of your getting that nasty response from somebody. I mean, I have no doubt that that you took a great deal of care in writing a letter that you sent to that person. So, it's not easy on the other side either.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to reward myself. I like to pile up a few rejections and then an acceptance at the end, so I finish the day feeling good. I wanted to talk a little bit about book reviews and being reviewed and criticism and that process as well, because I think it has a similar trajectory for some people. It can be a very threatening time when your work's being professionally reviewed. And I suppose as well I wanted to ask you about having relationships with people in the media, not marrying them, but how important it is to have sort of connections when you're trying to sell a book. How important it is for the writer to have those personal connections, and whether working writers should be also working to build those networks in the media.
That's a tough one, and I think it really kind of comes down to the individual. I mean, and how comfortable you are doing that. I mean, relationships are kind of everything in my profession. I don't think it's as necessary for the writer, but it really depends on what kind of writer they are. So there are a lot of writers who also review, so they then have a good relationship with that literary editor, and I would imagine that literary editor is then more likely to review that writer's new book because he or she will feel some sense of obligation to do that. But I don't think it's absolutely essential. I think certainly in a place like Adelaide, where you have such a strong arts and writing community, you have such a great festival, you have a local paper. It's probably easier to form some connections there. If you're going to all of to events, if you're going to other writers' launches, you're more likely to see the same people there who are very much at the forefront of the industry. I think it can all help, but I don't think it's essential, not at all. I think if the writing should almost speak for itself in a way, but I don't think it's something that you have to do. You certainly don't want to be forcing yourself onto people either. It could definitely have an adverse effect.
Yeah, you can tell when a writer's just looking to climb the ladder and not really interested in having a genuine.
But I think, sort of, becoming part of a larger community is always very helpful.
I think that is such a good point and a really, really important point, because very often, I know when I was, studying writing and going to courses like this, you would often get the sense that really what you needed to do was become a hustler. You know what I mean? Like, you needed to be that person who's always got the manuscript in their bag and always ready to buttonhole someone in the corner of a party and pull it out and say, and I mean, there are people who do that, but they're awful people. But I mean, there is another way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is actually you're all writers, you belong to a writing community, you should be reading, if you want to publish a book, you should be reading other people who want to publish books, other people who have published books, reading magazines, knowing what's going to the festivals and all the rest. And that way you forge relationships that are not predatory, that are not purely utilitarian, but are actually productive, and that if you're writing a certain kind of book and there are other people in this class who are writing a similar kind of book, of course you should be talking with each other. And of course, if one of you gets the book published, it's better for all of you. And it reduces that sort of sense, that horrible sense that you get sometimes in the industry, that it's kind of dog against dog and everyone's trying to claw each other down. It doesn't have to be like that. It can actually be a good thing if your friends get books published.
That's right. The other, I think that's absolutely right. The other thing that sort of is interesting, and I mean, it's not confined to this country, but these are sort of small clubs, and so there is, that can be sort of self-replicating. If you're in the club or you're not in the club, and I don't know how you break that except through persistence and talent, but there's a tendency for people to hold close a small group in a slightly larger circle, and that's where you go, and so if you can find ways of expanding those circles, that's in everyone's interest.
And so many writers are so generous to other writers, and particularly emerging writers, and that's incredibly important. I mean, if we have an author who says you really need to be looking out for this person because they've met them. I mean, we're always going to take notice of that.
Yeah.
So, it goes back to the the writing community. I think it's generally pretty supportive.
And that's why those ASA mentorships have been so valuable.
Yeah, they're terrific.
And the creative writing courses, I think, are really valuable in that as well. You've got really good teachers. I mean, especially here in Adelaide, you've got really good teachers. Who care about the talent. I mean, it reflects on them, of course. If you have people who are successful subsequently, but they care about it and they're invested in it. So.
Is there still such a thing as a geographical disadvantage? Do you think people in Adelaide are on the periphery of the national conversation? Do you think that we're missing out on something?
I think it's about the centre. It always disappears. The closer you get to it, it's still not there.
I still think Brisbane is the secret headquarters of Australian literature.
No, I don't think so. I think communication. I mean, we're all kind of there's so many different ways to communicate with people now. And I'm not just talking about Twitter and Facebook, but I think that there is a national conversation about writing and literature. And as I said before, I mean, you have the best writers' festival in the country. You're so lucky, and it's free. You have access to lots of great resources, but also there's a lot of Australian writers who are hugely successful who don't live in the capital cities. I was going to mention Mr. Flanagan, but he would have said at the start of his career that he was disadvantaged because he comes from Tasmania.
He would probably still say that he is.
Yeah, he very well might. But no, I don't think that South Australian writers should have any kind of chip on their shoulder about that at all. And there's some terrific writers from this city, from this state, and I think that good writing finds a way.
Which brings me to social media. Is it important for writers to be online? Is it necessary for writers to be online?
I don't think so. I feel very strongly that if you are not comfortable tweeting or being on Facebook, then you shouldn't do it because you're probably just going to do it badly. The people who do it well, it's fantastic. I'm not one of them. We have someone at Text who's fantastic on Twitter. And,
Who is that?
Oh, Elena, she's amazing. I can't do that, So I think you just have to do what's right for you. I think it depends on the genre of book that you're writing. So I think it's more important for children's writers to kind of engage with their audience. But you can have like a website if you're not comfortable tweeting, But again, and blogging is the other thing that if you're not comfortable with tweeting, then blogging is another thing, a good thing for writers to do. I mean, there's a lot of great blogs out there, and it might just be the writer talking about the kind of books that they like, and I find that quite interesting. But no, I don't think that you should feel pressure to do that if you're not comfortable with it. But if it's something you do want to explore, then your publisher would help you with that. I mean, we have a few writers who have Facebook pages that we help them manage. But no, I don't think it's essential at all.
I mean, I would say you do social media because it's fun. I really like Twitter, and I've made lots of good friends through it. There's a very strong writing community in Australia on Twitter in terms of that geographical stuff we were talking about before. It is one way to get to know people who are outside your kind of local area or whatever. But I mean, look, I agree. If you're just doing it because you've got some notion, what did they used to say? That you had to be a brand of one or whatever, and this was part of curating your brand.
Personal branding.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Like you come across, it just comes across as lame, and and silly. So I think it's useful and fun if it's something that you enjoy, and I encourage everyone to kind of try. I mean, particularly with Twitter, there is that weird process that people go through of, you know, the first week and a half that you're doing it, you're thinking, what the hell is this about? You know, why are people doing this? But there's this kind of addictiveness to the process that takes across. And if you're someone who enjoys that, it's been really great for me.
It's been great for me actually as well, and I think living as I was until a month ago up in the Clare Valley, in a tiny town of about 256 people, it really kept me sane. It has really kept me sane for the last 3 years, being able to talk shop, have that officey kind of conversation with fellow writers. But I think, you still do have to have that sense of, while you're not obsessed by your personal brand, I think you still have to have a sense of yourself as a professional person and not start trolling or
putting up too much personal information. I mean, you know, it's, you don't want to be talking about your ingrown toenail or. There's a lot of people on Twitter who put up, you know what I mean? There's a lot of people on Twitter who really put up. It's like, well, I don't want to follow you anymore because I don't want to hear about your personal ailments.
Yeah.
Yes, so that is the thing. It is a public.
You know,
it is a public.
Yeah, you have to remember.
Everything you put up there is there forever.
Yes.
So the drunk tweets, you know, perhaps not such a great idea.
Don't tweet in anger.
I decided I was temperamentally not well suited to it, because I'm a bit of a smart ass and I have too many hats, and I thought this could just get me into trouble.
Let yourself go.
No, too complicated. Too complicated. But I'm interested in the sort of the blogging stuff, and I mean, it sort of came to mind recently. I was at an event that David Sedaris was doing, and as part of that, he read his perfectly polished pieces, but then he read some of his diaries, and you could see how the diary entries had, you know, become parts of pieces or would become parts of pieces. And I was sort of intrigued about whether, you know, because a lot of people would do that sort of writing now in a sort of blog forum rather than in their own personal diary. And I was just sort of interested in, you know, just as you're talking, you know, what that process is of something that's sort of already in a public domain, a sort of quasi-public domain, but that you might want to take and use in some other more polished form later.
It's an interesting line, and I think it's shifted a lot. I started blogging about 10 years ago, and all of my blog posts are still up. You can go back and read my 10-year-old blog posts where I'm travelling through Japan or whatever. And it's not very focused on writing at the time, it's more focused. I started it as a thing when I was travelling around the world and wanted to keep people in touch with what I was doing. And then it kind of evolved into more of a diarisation of my professional life and the way that I think about things. And it's probably evolved to the point where I don't blog as much as I used to because that's less personal. But it is a really interesting way to keep track of what you're doing as well. And I think as a writer, it's a great practice to be able to sit down and do something every week or every month and to produce 700 words or so that makes sense. It's important.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's just the practice, isn't it? I mean, so much of this stuff is about just getting into the practice of doing it.
Yeah, and Twitter as well, it's a literary form. You know, most writers enjoy it because they like writing. They like the concision.
Certainly, it would seem to me that it's much better to be writing for a blog than writing for a bottom drawer. You know, because at least, even if it's just your personal blog and not that many people are reading it, you've got an implied audience. You know, there's a sense that you are actually putting it out there where other people can kind of read it. It gets you over that preciousness of nobody can see what I've done.
It's my angsty confessions.
Yeah.
Well, on the note of blogging and participation, I think it's time to open up to questions. We've got about 15 minutes. So if anyone has any questions for these three wonderful experts over here, sir.
I just wanted to go back to the funding grants, prizes and so forth. I know that in academia, if you have a certain number of opportunities at a certain level, and then a couple of years later you're still holding your hand up with the same opportunities at the same level, you really start to look like somebody who can't build on those opportunities, and you might consider to get the attention. Is that similarly true in your world? Is it sort of like, well, you've got $10,000 and you're still asking for another $10,000? Is that the way it pans out?
Do you mean, so if you've won a prize, then applying, like then submitting work for the same prize?
I'm sort of more referring to any opportunity. So if you achieve a certain level of success as a writer of fiction, is there a sort of time limit on which you might be expected to build on that, or is there certain things?
No, I don't think so.
I mean, it's a really interesting problem and I think it's not confined to this country, but it's the mid-career band, which is tricky for all creatives, So
I call it a slump rather than a band.
But it's how you actually go from having the promise of being an emerging writer, or artist, or musician, or whatever it is. And in this country, we're quite good at supporting emerging writers. I mean, it may not feel like it if you're in that situation, but there are little bits of pockets of money here and there. Everyone's sort of interested. There's prizes for emerging writers. There's mentorships. There's a whole lot of stuff. It's not enormously lucrative, but it's not insignificant. And before that, we've got quite a good education system that encourages people to reach a level of capacity. So then we've got this reasonable support that happens in the emerging writer space, and then it's sort of sink or swim in the middle bit, and it's really hard, because you can burn out that newness, and so people aren't interested because you're not new, but you haven't cracked it for the really big thing that takes you to the next level. And I mean, because of the work I've done in sort of cultural policy stuff over the last couple of years, I'm really intensely aware that there's this group of people who are enormously talented, have got great capacity, but whether it's because of the side of the market, because of the demands in their own life, you've got to actually find a way to support yourself, support your family, whatever it is, that it's very difficult to make it through that sort of bit in the middle, and get the luck maybe, or just have the sheer brilliance that takes you to that next band.
And I think the Australian Council are trying to address that.
They are trying to address it, yeah.
With a number of grants for festivals, publishers, authors who are in that mid-list category, and there are a lot of authors in that category.
It's how things get going, like in a music sense, how they go from being new to being on the repertoire. I mean, that's the really difficult bit, and we're not really well, because the default will often be, we'll now bring somebody in from America, Canada, New Zealand, blah, 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 so we can fill that space up with people who've reached that level in a bigger market. And I mean, those supports are going to be important, but there's a bigger sort of market question. I think you've just got to find your own level. I don't think there's no template that makes it easy.
Particularly with something like poetry and to a lesser extent short fiction, there's nowhere to emerge to. I mean, if you're a poet, you publish in journals, you enter competitions, and occasionally people might get books published, but no poetry books in Australia sell at all. So there isn't, what I mean? There is just the one level, and that's it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's one of the things, it's sort of a bit beyond the scope of this, but one of the things that I'm sort of interested in is how you get that sort of movement happening between different art forms at that sort of level. You talk about the poetry, there's a fantastic poetry collection, or sort of a long poetry thing it's called the Petrov poem, by a Canberra-based poet, and it's like the Petrov story. And it's a sort of long narrative poem, but it's just brilliant. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of work. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, people should know about this. How do you find it? Maybe it needs to be made into an interactive multimedia thing, because then you can get, it's about trying to get those sort of linkages that maybe get you into a different space, which is not only being read by poetry readers, but by people who are interested in other things at the same time.
And in some ways, the mid-career kind of slump is a really great time to diversify how you think about your work and experiment as well, I think.
That is, if you've got time to do it after you've done your day job and look after your kids and paid your mortgage and everything else.
I just had another question down the front here.
Well, attached to that is that it's okay, all that support, but there seems to be very little for non-fiction. I've written a non-fiction book and self-published, and there's virtually no prizes available, and very little place where you can actually go with it. Even though I know that there's great competition in the fiction world, once you get into non-fiction, it seems to be just desert.
I thought there was a
non-fiction literary,
yeah.
But if you've written a book, well, it's hard to describe.
There's biography prizes, and there's
history prizes.
There's biography and history prizes, so different subgenres.
And if you don't meet a particular genre,
it is hard. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're non-fiction writing, you're extended non-fiction writing, so that's sort of category.
Yes, I mean the difficulty is that non-fiction isn't really a category. You know what I mean? It's a category defined by what it's
well,
not.
non-fiction is everything that's
Yeah,
not,
totally.
that's not
So-
fiction. So then, you know, really, people, when you're thinking non-fiction, are really just thinking biography or
It's something we've thought
some
about.
sort of historical thing. And once you don't get into that, well, then really you might as well be in Antarctica.
It's something we've thought about a lot because non-fiction is our strength at Overland. We have a poetry prize and a fiction prize. The logical thing is to do an essay prize, but it's very hard to know how exactly it would work because essays tend to have to be themed in some kind of way for it to kind of make sense. And also, I don't think there's a demand for it that there is that there's an almost inexhaustible supply of people writing fiction, but we receive far fewer essays than we do for fiction or poetry.
We don't. We get masses of
Really?
essays, masses of essays and memoir and reportage, diary, you know, a whole lot of stuff. I mean, I think it's sort of interesting because, you know, like you look at the sort of, by comparison with the United States, you know, where non-fiction is absolutely the dominant mode, you know, for all the noise that there is around fiction. You know, if you look at the publishing profile, it's primarily non-fiction. And that's not so much the case here anymore. I mean, you don't publish, you publish very little non-fiction, don't you?
Well, it's funny. It's cyclical. So last year I think was very heavily dominated by big novels. This year we are actually publishing a lot of non-fiction, a lot more than we did last year. And then sometimes it's just how your publishing program turns out. So books that we thought we were going to be ready for next year slipped into this year and so on. But yeah, we have a lot more publishing non-fiction coming up.
Yeah. What's your sort of writing? What do you?
Well, it's hard to put into one thing. It's about power and control in relationships, but it goes far beyond self-help. It's got elements of that, and the social structure that leads to that.
But it's not academic. It's
Well, it's not really. It doesn't meet one or the other. That's the problem. It doesn't fall into one or the other. It's certainly got academic overtones, but I'm trying to reach a more general audience.
There are bits and pieces. I mean, I think you've probably done a bit of a search, but you know, ABR has a bunch of essay prizes that perhaps you could extract something from it into an essay. I mean, obviously,
sort of got and I can't be specific now because it's a while since I looked at all those, but I sort of got the idea that really that was all about a sort of narrative non-fiction, if you know what I mean. A lot of that stuff.
Sure exactly.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that the things that they've awarded have been across a number of different styles.
and then there's the Australia Council will fund non-fiction projects. I don't know about arts essay, but I imagine they probably do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Sally. Thanks for today. I'm just wondering if you can identify any upcoming trends of certain genres in fiction. I guess we've had fantasy run. Is there anything particular that's popular at the moment, or as you just take each manuscript as it
Really,
comes
yeah.
and
You know, yeah. We're just looking at the quality.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, text hasn't got a strong kind of history of publishing fantasy or science fiction, but we're going to publish something next year because it was another one that came through the text prize. Just thought it was terrific. So you know, we'll just publish what we think is good writing, regardless of the genre. Yeah. I don't know.
Picking trends is a mug's game. It's very difficult. You know, there are people who spend, you know, who are paid small fortunes to do that. You know, analysing the movement of metadata, analysing the, you know, the cyclical interests of, you know, random people all around the world. You know, I mean, it's as I say, it's a mug's game. I mean, who would have thought that 50 Shades of Grey would have sold 80 million copies? You know?
Well, that's not really my approach. Like, I've written a travel narrative, and you know, there was obviously a spate of those sort of books, and I guess they continue to come out. But,
Well, a successful book will always produce copycats. You know, so and every publisher's guilty of that. It's like, oh wow, such and such did really, really well.
Let's have 5 more.
Let's try and find something that's just like that.
Yeah.
And most times it doesn't work. We never stop trying, pathetically. It almost never works. I mean, and there's books that will always surprise you, like 50 Shades of Grey. But I'm trying to think of another example. But there's always a book that you just think, oh my goodness, this topic is so obscure and it's so strange, it will never work, and then it ends up becoming a bestseller. So I mean, I think The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is not a bad example. I mean, the first 50 pages of that book are astonishingly boring, and then it descends into quite horrible sexual violence. but that's a mega seller. I wouldn't have, if that had come to me at an acquisitions meeting, I would not have bought it. In fact, I think we turned it down.
Quite the fool.
No, I think we did. I think we did turn it down, and also the author was dead, so there was no one to promote it. No, it would never work. So it goes precisely to Julianne's point that you just. If you try and think of what's going to be the next big thing, you'll miss it every time.
We did an issue, actually, Jen, you were in our next big thing issue years and years ago, weren't you? Yeah, so we did an issue next big thing about, 8 years ago. And I think if I look at the list of names of people there, they've all gone on, almost all of them have gone on to be a significant theme, whether it was the biggest next big thing, but they're all people who've made a mark. That was sort of an interesting process. But my counter-example to yours is that this time last year we published an edition of Griffith Review called Tasmania, the Tipping Point. And I remember people at Tech saying, oh, I don't know if this is going to work, but Tasmanians sort of like to read about Tasmania, oh, I don't know if it's going to work. We've sold nearly 20,000 copies of that edition.
It's amazing.
I mean, it's amazing. We were only just picked by Richard Flanagan for the best-selling book in Tasmania last year.
Fantastic.
So it's sort of it is as I say, it's a sort of it's a bit of a mug's game.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I have a question for Julianne. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
You said that about a third of the articles that you publish were from emerging writers, but I see Griffith Review as like one of the top tier of literary journals. What do you think there are steps up from getting published at different journals that come before you picking writers who are published at different journals?
Because we work on a theme basis, it's sort of, if somebody's published in, Overland or Meanjin or, like Wet Ink or, something like that, that's, we'll take that into account. But a bit like as Jane is saying, it will be an assessment, in our case, not just of the quality, because there's a lot of stuff of very high quality that comes in that we can't use. Because what our approach is a really sort of quite highly curated thing, that so we will say, well, we're going to have these are the core building blocks of the edition, and then we want to amplify, we want to take that in a different direction. And so we'll be making choices between pieces of equivalent quality, but for a thematic purpose that they work in the context of the other pieces. So, so long as you're writing at that high level, your chances are good, but in a way the decision will always be ours, because we've got some other product that we're creating, which is not just being a platform for publishing that writing. So I just be pushing it out everywhere and watching our themes.
Sneak in one more from this gentleman up the back in the striped shirt. Yes, you sir.
I was just a bit intrigued with your response to tyranny of location. I live in Tumby Bay, and when we said there's no real big deal about location, I had to agree with it. I haven't suffered one bit from being over there, but it was automatic assumption when we talked about location, and South Australia was Adelaide, and it is very hard for writers in the country, because we have to, there's some forums I'd like to go every Thursday for the next 5 weeks. Just can't do it. And we've had one visit from Jude Appleton, which was brilliant. Really appreciate that. I wrote some copy for the local paper. I write feature articles for the Times. I've probably done about 20 in the last year and a half. I just write them down there, any subject I like. Fire them in. So there is an advantage at some points in the country, because they're desperate for copy, and they haven't got a lot of staff, and they haven't got very good budgets, and they get a full page from me about once a fortnight for free. And the readership have now encouraged me to label that stuff, add to it, put it into a book, which I've done, and it's being published soon, I hope. But to Jeff in particular, am I doing myself a disservice by putting it out like that? in a little small country paper. I've got feedback, I get critics, I get...
No, it sounds like...
I won't suffer for that.
No, of course not. No. It's always better to be writing for an audience than not writing for an audience, and the discipline of being edited and meeting deadlines and all the rest of it. It's all good. Look, I'm conflicted about the geographical stuff. I mean, we've put a really big focus into our online presence. We have 500,000 visits a year to our website. Overland's been going for 60. It's our anniversary this year. But when we look at the stats, our subscribers are still overwhelmingly Melbourne based, and our readers and the people that we publish, Melbourne is far overrepresented. Now, it's not a conscious thing, but it is kind of interesting the way geography, even in the midst of all this digital stuff, geography does still play a bit of a factor, in the sense that, I mean, I know more people in Melbourne than I do. I've never been to Adelaide before. It seems very nice and all, but I mean, I think it does have consequences in quite unexpected sorts of ways. I don't know very much about what it's like to be a regional writer, but I could imagine that there would be particular challenges that regional writers would have.
There's no copyright issue there. I put a piece out as many times when I reuse it again.
But you own the copyright.
So they'll have
remuneration. In fact, when I go in to read an article,
well, so but that will just be the publisher's decision, whether they, whether they will regard you as having, been published in a competitive journal.
I've got a very talented young cartoonist, and he just throws them in for fun, and so
you do sound as though, sorry. It says that you sound as though you have used the fact that you're in a regional area to your advantage really well, though.
Yeah,
you haven't let that stop you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming along to something like this is also a fabulous way to get more involved with the writing communities. Attend your writers' centre, join your writers' centre, attend the events.
And also look for courses and support online. There are a lot of things now. There's a lot of podcasts, a lot of sort of webinars and things like that are happening online. I mean, I was looking the other day at something that I had to write, which was about narrative long-form journalism, and there's some great things that are available. Where you can get that sort of support and a sense of a community that will help you, expand your craft in a sense. In that space. Just on your Melbourne thing, I mean, we very deliberately try. I mean, that's the other factor that we will take into account in making those decisions about what's included, is we will very much try to make sure that we've got representatives, we've got writers from all around the country, that we've got, men and women, that we've got Indigenous writers, that we run a sort of tally, that we're making sure that, not that we're selecting pieces on the basis of that, but we just want to be as sort of as broad in our view as we can.
I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, so let's thank our fabulous guests.
Thank you. And thank you very much for coming along. Please get down tonight as we go and see stuff. Buy books, that's really great. Buy books.
Buy books, read them, talk to the people.
Yeah, I mean, our website's also a great resource, but please join me again in keeping content in the panel.
Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen.
If anyone has any sort of admin business, not very good at it, but I'll give it a go.
I've got a sessions up in Adelaide and then